Hello, I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning, or ACFP. We're helping Australians get together to plan a better future for their nation. And one of our big concerns about the future is, of course, climate change. Most Australians acknowledge that climate change is the biggest threat to our future. But what many may not fully realise yet is just how close we are to irreversible catastrophe from global heating. Scientists have been warning us for decades, but as yet, no country has stepped up with enough in carbon emission reduction efforts to come anywhere near stopping the heating. Now we probably have about a decade left to stop it, or less, if all countries keep refusing to offer much more than they are in reductions of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. ACFP keeps a close eye on the science of climate change. We need to, if we're to help Australians set up a plan that will actually ensure their safe future on the planet. Because we look closely at the science, we know the world is running seriously short of time to limit global heating to safe levels. We have less time than we might think. Most media commentators are accepting that if nations reduce their carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, that this will stop the heating. But the year by which we reach net zero is irrelevant if that year ends up being sometime after we have already emitted too much in total tonnes of greenhouse gases to stop the heating. Because greenhouse gases, once emitted, don't disappear from the atmosphere at the end of each year, in fact, in the main they stay there and accumulate for hundreds of years, the truth is that the cumulative emissions tonnage is the real target we need to focus on, rather than a distant target for net zero by a particular year. It's the total tonnage of emissions that matters, and the date by which the world needs to reach net zero is the day before the world emits more in carbon than that tonnage. But what is that tonnage? That is what the world now needs to agree on urgently, otherwise we will not stop the heating. At the COP26 conference set for November 2021 in Glasgow, we have a chance to agree on what tonnage of emissions is safe and what is not. And we have a chance to work out how to fairly share that remaining total tonnage of carbon and reach net zero before we emit too much. COP26 is the 26th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Australia is a party to this convention, and we are a signatory to an agreement made under the convention in Paris in 2015. We made this agreement with more than 190 other countries to do our utmost to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, recognising that this lower temperature, the 1.5 degree target, would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. COP26 is likely to be our last chance to set things in train to meet this target. Everything about the Paris Agreement and the planet is at stake at COP26. Australia has everything to gain if we meet the temperature targets of the agreement, and everything to lose if we don't. But as they're going about it at the moment, the parties at COP26 are unlikely to agree on everything they need to do to meet the temperature targets. We need to slightly reorient the conference agenda because the parties have been deadlocked into inaction on emissions reduction ever since they signed the Paris Agreement. And this is clear from the most recent report from the United Nations, the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDC Synthesis Report. Under the Paris Agreement, countries are obliged to notify the UN of how they will be increasing their nationally determined contributions to stop climate change. This requires them, among other things, to commit to greater and greater reductions in their annual carbon emissions over time, with the primary aim of reaching net zero before high temperatures are locked in. Unfortunately, the Paris Agreement doesn't have a mechanism that will encourage parties to pledge enough in emissions reductions to meet the temperature targets in the agreement. We can see it's not working in the results of the NDC Synthesis Report. The current negotiating mechanism in the Paris Agreement relies on the willingness of all countries to offer voluntary contributions of reductions in their carbon emissions. But it gives them no assurance that they will be treated fairly. It gives them no guarantee, if they do offer up a contribution, that some other country will not take advantage of that and do less. So it hasn't established a basis for trust and fairness in either negotiations or actual emissions reduction. Because there is no agreed transparent basis of fairness, the current negotiating mechanism is effectively discouraging cooperation. In the main, what we've ended up with is more than 190 countries reticently waiting to see what others will offer before they take the initiative and offer in full what they must offer if we're to meet the temperature targets. It's not enough to offer to reach net zero by a particular year, say 2050, if by that date we will have already emitted too many tonnes of carbon and thereby embedded irreversible global heating. But that is what the current mechanism in the Paris Agreement is embedding. All countries are waiting too long. Meanwhile, emissions are building up too fast, which is now seriously shortening the time we have left to limit temperature increases to 1.5 or 2 degrees. After 6 years of the Paris Agreement, here's the result. Many countries have increased their pledges, although, as I record this, Australia is not yet one of them. But they haven't increased them by enough in total or fast enough. Pledges on offer at September 2021 do no more than set the world on track to heat by up to 4.5 degrees by 2060. There is now a huge gap between the sum of the pledged emission reductions and the amount of reduction we need by 2030 to stay on track and stop the heating at 1.5 degrees. It's a negotiating disaster, which is locking in a fatal hesitancy. The hesitancy results from the fact that the agreement doesn't give countries a target for the total tonnage of carbon they can still emit before the heating is locked in. There is a finite limit to the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted to the atmosphere if the temperature aims of the Paris Agreement are to be met. Scientists know what the finite limits are for each degree of heating. They know there is now a very small budget of carbon that we can still emit in tonnes before the heating gets out of control. At COP26, the world needs to face up to the limits of that now very small budget, and they need to work out how to fairly share what's left of it. Negotiating to hit the temperature target without setting a carbon budget is like building a skyscraper from the top down without laying a foundation first. We need to inject something stable into the Paris Agreement, a solid platform from which we can work to build up plans that will actually stop the heating. That platform is the carbon budget. It's not there in the Paris Agreement at the moment, but if we add it in and ensure we choose a reasonably safe budget, we still have a chance of limiting heating to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. It's our last chance, but it's there. So, how can the world select the safest carbon budget at COP26? The one that might still stop the heating at a tolerable level? How can we stop ourselves running along this line instead run along this line? The COP26 organisers know it's tight. So their strategy in the absence of an agreed carbon budget is to push hard now with calls for more ambitious NDCs than have been forthcoming from the parties to date. The implicit, if not explicit, expectation of the organisers is that pledges of 50% reductions in emissions by 2030, or preferably much sooner, will meet the necessary level of ambition. They're also likely to celebrate COP26 as a success if all nations, in addition to pledging 50% reductions by 2030, commit to reaching net zero by 2050. But if the parties in negotiations content themselves with that, then it's game over for the 1.5 degree target and probably even the 2 degree target. 50% reductions by 2030 and net zero by 2050 will lock in way too much in tonnes of emissions. It sets us on a track to exceed the carbon budget well before we reach net zero. Anyone can see this if we do the maths. So let's see what the maths is telling us. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says the world can emit no more than another 400 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide on top of what we have emitted since the Industrial Revolution. From the end of 2020, 400 billion tonnes of CO2 is all we can emit ever, if we want a 67% chance of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In 2019, global emissions were reported for the 2018 year as 36 billion tonnes. And then in 2020, they were reported as about 43 billion tonnes for the previous year, depending on what we take into account. So starting from there, if annual global emissions are reduced in a straight line from the end of 2020 to chart a path by which we could theoretically reach net zero by 2050, how many tonnes of CO2 does the world still add into the atmosphere while travelling along this slow, steady path to net zero? The answer is 668 billion tonnes, which is 268 billion tonnes or 67% more than the 400 billion tonne limit. And with that particular straight line of emissions reductions, theoretically enabling the world to reach net zero by 2050, how soon does the world blow the 400 billion tonne carbon budget and lock in heating above 1.5 degrees? The answer is by the year 2030. So obviously a target of net zero by 2050 will be too little, too late. And the request from COP26 organisers for 50% reductions by 2030 is also nowhere near enough to meet the temperature targets. If we stick with the path of reductions that the organisers are calling for, we will blow the carbon budget 20 years before we reach net zero, which will lock in heating well above 2 degrees. So let's do the maths again, this time to calculate the time we may still have to reach net zero without blowing the 400 billion tonne budget. For a 67% chance of limiting heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and assuming all countries work to reduce their emissions in a straight line, year on year to zero, when does the world need to reach net zero without blowing the 400 billion tonne budget? The answer is by the year 2037, not 2050. So if the world can work out a way to stay within that budget and do everything possible to reach net zero by 2037, then we might have a chance, a 67% chance, of limiting heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We might also have a 33% chance of failing, so it's only a medium level of confidence. And that medium level of confidence unfortunately requires a qualifier, because it doesn't take into account the fact that the 400 billion tonne budget is only for carbon dioxide and excludes consideration of other greenhouse gases that may be emitted, like methane. It also excludes a contingency amount for more carbon that may be released if Earth system feedbacks, such as melting permafrost, add more CO2 back into the atmosphere. So a 400 billion tonne budget doesn't offer a reasonable degree of safety. In fact, when other greenhouse gases are added in, scientists have concluded that the budget must shrink quite a lot. According to the Climate Council, we may have as little as 110 billion tonnes left in emissions that we can add into the atmosphere before we lock in heating above 1.5 degrees. At the current rates of global emissions, a budget like that might be consumed in just 3 years. On this reckoning, a 400 billion tonne budget doesn't offer the safety all countries dearly wanted when they signed the Paris Agreement. It would be a far safer bet that we might keep temperature rises close to 1.5 degrees if we adopted a global carbon budget of somewhere between 200 and 250 billion tonnes, say 235 billion tonnes. If we had set a carbon budget sooner, we could have given ourselves a bigger budget than that, but we didn't. So a budget of 235 billion tonnes will probably strike a balance between what is still physically achievable in tonnage reductions in this decade and what is politically negotiable at a global level in policy terms and what is reasonably safe in temperature terms. So it's worth doing the maths again, this time for a safer budget. If all countries work together within a 235 billion tonne budget to reduce annual emissions in a straight line down to zero, how soon do we need to reach net zero to avoid blowing this safer carbon budget? The answer is by the year 2030. That's the same year by which the COP26 organisers are hoping for a 50% reduction. But to give the world a fairly secure chance of meeting temperature targets, they should be calling for a 100% reduction by 2030. They should be calling for net zero by 2030, not 2050. To meet this safer carbon budget, global emissions would need to be reduced by just over 4.3 billion tonnes a year, year on year, for the next 10 years. Is it physically possible? Yes, but not if we keep delaying. The Paris Agreement is a mechanism that is not well built for stopping these deadly delays. It anticipates that countries will have the luxury of another opportunity to increase their pledges in 2025, and that this will not be too late. The conference organisers appear to be working within this assumption, but it conveys the impression that the temperature targets can still be met if steeper emission reductions come towards the end of the 2020 decade. This is called back-ending the reductions. That might have been a reasonable approach when the Paris Agreement was struck, but the world has since wasted 6 years and not reduced emissions. They're just building up and up. So if at COP26 we opt for the back-ended path, the annual reductions in the second half of the decade will need to be much, much steeper than 4.3 billion tonnes. It will introduce panic to the whole process, which will cause all sorts of flow-on panics, including for financial markets. It's far easier, less risky and less costly to start now and aim to achieve as much as possible in reductions before 2025. This is now an impending global emergency. It's one that will dwarf the coronavirus pandemic. Unless the world comes to agreement about a safe carbon budget and works out how to stick to it by fairly sharing it, it's game over in the next 5 years for climate change. That doesn't mean it's time to panic. It means it's time to prevent panic. Countries can work out how to share what's left of a safer carbon budget by a simple, transparent method which offers the fairness necessary to build confidence among the parties that everyone will stick to it through to the end at 2030. The simple approach is to set a carbon budget that is reasonably safe and then divide it up so that countries can emit no more than the percentage share they emitted in 2019, the pre-COVID year. That opens up a possibility where every country can move steadily and with relative calm backwards from their current level of emissions. They must track back anyway, but this allows them to do it without too adversely affecting each country in relation to its stage of development. It minimises the possibility of growth in inequality between developed and developing countries. This simple mechanism gives each country a chance to plan out exactly how they will meet net zero within their budget of emissions, rather than by a date that will be too late. That's something they can't do if they continue to lean on the current mechanism of voluntary and slow contributions. Having a carbon budget, and knowing that every other country has one too, gives every country better confidence that their efforts won't be wasted. Once a country has an idea of its total remaining budget of emissions, it will be far easier to work out what they will each have to do to reach net zero before they blow their budget. No country is even trying to work that out now. They're looking purely at reductions by an irrelevant date rather than what they can emit as a maximum. They all need to switch over to focusing on their maximum carbon budget and plan out how to live within it. As an example, we can look at how this would work for Australia. Excluding emissions from exports, Australia emitted 0.53 billion tonnes of greenhouse gases in 2019. This equated to about 1.5% of global emissions, although on some estimates it may have been around 1.4%. But assuming that Australia negotiates a 1.5% share of remaining emissions, and assuming a safer budget of 235 billion tonnes is favoured, this would give Australia a final carbon budget of 3.53 billion tonnes. It would mean that we could emit no more than 3.53 billion tonnes ever. To make sure we hit net zero before we emit more than that, Australia would need to reduce its emissions by just over 50 million tonnes a year from the end of 2020 compared to the amount we emitted in 2019. With drops of 50 million tonnes a year, Australia would hit net zero with budget to spare, or about a year to spare if there had been any mishaps or more delays. Drops of 50 million tonnes a year are physically feasible for Australia, and in any case, there's no point in arguing that they're not, or that they shouldn't be attempted when the alternative of excessive global heating will cause much more trouble and expense for Australians than the reductions would cause. Anyway, in Australia's case, the emission reductions are highly advantageous for our economy. In fact, because of the type of economy and resources we have, a slow run to net zero would cost Australia much more than a swift run. As researchers at Melbourne University have shown, the cost to Australia if the world fails to stop global heating is a minimum of $584 billion by 2030. But the cost to our economy if the world can solve it by 2030 is a mere $36 billion. What Australia can't afford is for the world to fail on the heating targets. So we need to pitch in as hard as we can and stop behaving uncooperatively on the international stage. Many Australians are doing the right thing at home by switching to renewables, and many businesses are now pitching in too. Much more progress will be made over the next decade, but it is likely to be wasted if we don't also lift our game in the international negotiations. The suggested safer carbon budget of 235 billion tonnes and this simple method of fairly sharing it benefits every country. For developing countries, it will enable them to devise detailed plans that will ensure they hit net zero before their budget is exhausted, and these can be costed and submitted with applications for any finance necessary to ensure they can actually meet the targets. The UN can audit these costed plans and form a clear view of the aggregate of the finance needed. This will give developed countries like Australia a clear idea of what they'll be expected to contribute to help less developed countries. Everyone will have greater certainty, which is essential for the trust needed to keep all countries on track for the next decade. It is possible to stop global heating in a decade if the world stops stalling and starts now. If countries like Australia reverse their uncooperative behaviour and commit to fairly sharing the remaining global budget, they can make a world of difference. Imagine what it would feel like to get on top of the global heating problem within a decade. We still can. Imagine what it would do for confidence in the global economy during the 2020s if, at or very soon after COP26, all countries came to agreement on the remaining budget and committed to staying within it. Imagine how exciting it would be to see them work together in an unprecedented collaboration to solve this unprecedented threat, knowing that they can solve it. Conversely, let's imagine for a moment that we don't find a way to work together as a decent international community and the world moves beyond the point where we can solve it. The COP26 organisers know what that looks like. You can read about it and about COP26 here. Links are in the description. It's not an overstatement to say that everything is at stake at COP26. So we need to do everything possible to strengthen the negotiating mechanism in the Paris Agreement for a chance of real success at the meeting. What do we get if we continue to rely on the current negotiating mechanism in the Paris Agreement and the calls for 50% reductions by 2030 and net zero by 2050? We get temperatures way above 2 degrees, and with that we lose the planet as we know it and we devastate humanity. Countries like Australia can lead the world to stop this. If you'd like to be part of that, you can sign ACFP's petition calling for Australia to propose a new negotiating framework in the Paris Agreement based on fair sharing of what little remains of the world's carbon emissions. Links to the petition are in the description. And if you'd like to know more about the feasibility of cutting Australia's emissions to zero in a decade and what policies must be implemented by our governments to maximise our chances of success, check out this episode of Snapshots from Australia Together, Australia's first National Community Futures Plan. This is about the strategies necessary in Australia for stopping climate change in the 2020 decade. Links are in the description. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.